How would you feel if you lost your job today? Stressed? To me, yes, it's stressful, but it's just an inconvenience. It's not a financial burden, and that's what it feels like to have an emergency fund. Hey, I'm Sam, and today we're going to be talking about everything emergency funds. What they are, why they're super important, and how you can set one up for yourself and how to go about using them. I love our emergency fund because it gives us incredible peace of mind, and I'm sure that anyone else who has an emergency fund would agree. In the past, and I think a lot of other people would be in the same boat, I used to have a savings account where I would pile up a whole lot of money, and I know theoretically I could have used that in an emergency if I needed to. But I found by actually calculating how much you need in an emergency fund and then putting that money away in a dedicated account so that you can't touch it creates enormous peace of mind. And I don't think you can really appreciate how amazing an emergency fund is until you've set one up and you use it for the first time for yourself. So, what is an emergency fund? Basically, all an emergency fund is you piling up a whole lot of money for a rainy day. It's basically money that you've set aside specifically for an emergency situation. And this just prevents you from taking out a credit card or putting it on debt if you end up in a situation where you incur a big expense and you can't pay for it out of pocket. I think a lot of people treat credit cards as kind of an emergency fund and saying, if anything were to happen, I could just put it on the credit card and deal with it later. And yes, you could do that. But normally in an emergency situation, the last thing you want to think about is the interest accruing on that loan you've just taken out on your credit card. So if you've got money set aside to deal with these circumstances, then at least you don't have that additional financial burden on top of whatever's just happened. It gives you peace of mind knowing that if anything was to happen to you or your loved ones, you wouldn't have to worry about your finances. And I just love this idea because if you really are in an emergency situation, your finances is the last thing you're going to want to think about. So why is an emergency fund so important? Well, basically it gives you stability and it gives you a backup plan. So when things happen in your life, and it's not if they will happen, it's when they happen, you'll have money put aside to handle it. It changes your mindset in those situations from being a massive headache and a financial burden that you can't afford to being basically a road bump and an inconvenience in your day. You know you've got the money put aside to cover it, you just have to get the money out and pay for the expense. And it might just take some time out of your day rather than crippling you financially. I know which option I'd rather have. I really do think that by trying to reduce your financial stresses as much as you can in your life, this will improve any relationships that you also have, because financial stress can be one of the most pressing things on a relationship. So if you can provide you and your loved ones a safety net, that is such an invaluable thing to do. The other great thing about an emergency fund is that having savings set aside equals freedom. And that can be freedom to take some risks and make some decisions on your own terms. So instead of sticking out a job that you hate and feeling like you can't leave because you've got to pay the bills, you could leave that job knowing that you've got money set aside to cover your expenses and go and find something that you love doing. That's the kind of thing you can do if you've got a backup plan and some money set aside. So what constitutes an emergency? When should you use this emergency fund? Basically, emergencies are whatever you define them to be. But some generally good guidelines is that they're expenses that you can't possibly foresee happening. So they're things that you otherwise couldn't budget for or predict happening in your life that would actually tangibly impact the way that you live your everyday life and you need to fix it ASAP. That's what constitutes an emergency. So things like the roof of your house falls in, or you have a massive pipe burst and a water leak all of a sudden. Maybe you lose your job unexpectedly, or your income reduces suddenly for some reason. Maybe you lose a loved one and there's some unexpected costs that come up during that process. An emergency fund is not a personal spending budget for your next holiday or shopping spree. I like to think of my emergency fund as money that I cannot touch. It's no longer my money, it's allocated to something, and if I ever need it, I can use it, but I don't think about that pile of cash every single day. So who needs an emergency fund? Well, basically everyone. Everyone can and should have some kind of an emergency fund. It might vary in size depending if you're still living at home or maybe you're paying off debt aggressively, but you should have at least a small amount of money put aside for a rainy day. So how much money do I need in an emergency fund? Most people say that you need between 3 to 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund. And this will depend on whether you're a single or dual income household and how reliable your source of income is and what your risk tolerance is. So maybe if you're someone who has really great job stability, you might err on more of the 3-month side of that. Whereas if you're someone who maybe does freelance work and your income is unpredictable, maybe you'd feel more comfortable going towards the 6 months end of that spectrum. And I guess the other piece of this is, what does your expenses mean? Basically, your expenses are anything you need to live. So making sure you've got somewhere to sleep, a roof over your head, you've got the lights on, and you've got some food in your belly. If you also want to include some other things in that, you can, but basically it's the bare expenses that you need to continue living. Normally this would exclude any sort of fun money that you're allocating yourself, because if you're in an emergency situation, you're probably not going to be using your fun money. So the first step to calculate your emergency fund value is to first do a budget. You need to figure out what your weekly or monthly expenses are so that you can project out what your 3 to 6 month emergency fund is going to look like. So if you've got extra spending money in your budget, or you're allocating extra resources to debts or a savings goal, that shouldn't be included in your emergency fund. It's only the expenses that you need to live that you should be including as expenses. So you basically want to find your weekly or maybe monthly expense value and multiply that out by however big you want your emergency fund to be. So basically the bigger your emergency fund is, the bigger the buffer you have. So it means that you could potentially live for 3 months or 6 months without an income, or you could cover unexpected expenses up to that value. My partner and I both have relatively secure jobs, so we like to have a 3-month emergency fund at the moment because we're still paying off some debt and have some other financial goals to meet. But eventually we might extend that to be 6 months of emergency fund. It just depends on our risk tolerance and how we're feeling about our finances. Alright, so you've calculated how much you need for your emergency fund, and now you've got this big old pile of money and you're wondering where to put it. So that's what we're going to talk through now. Where should you be keeping your emergency fund? So you might be tempted with such a large sum of money to put it in maybe a term deposit or in an investment account. However, that kind of defeats the purpose of an emergency fund. An emergency fund should be something that is easy to access in an emergency. And if you have to think twice before you're withdrawing money because you don't want to incur a fee, or maybe the market isn't good at the moment, that's not an emergency fund. You don't want to be thinking about those kind of things in an emergency. You want money that is liquid and easily available for you to draw from at any given time. An emergency fund isn't meant to make you rich, it's meant to keep you safe. Having the money readily available for you to access at any given time is value enough. So although you want the money to be liquid and easy to access, you don't want to be tempted to use it all the time. So the best place to put your emergency fund is in a high interest savings account in a bank or institution different from the one that you do your everyday banking in. So open up a new account in a totally separate bank that has a really good high interest savings rate and put all of your emergency fund there. That way, if you ever need to access it, it's easy enough to access, but you're not going to be seeing that big tempting sum of money in your everyday banking account when you log in. Alright, so you've now got yourself a full-fledged emergency fund and you've put it in a separate account ready to use whenever you need it. The next thing is, don't be afraid to use your emergency fund. Yes, it's a bit of a bummer to have to dip into it, but it's also super rewarding knowing that your emergency fund has done exactly what you wanted it to do. But you might be surprised how reluctant you are to actually dip into that account when an emergency expense does come up. I know that might be a little bit of a weird thing to say because you've intentionally put this money aside deliberately for emergencies. And the whole point of an emergency fund is to take the financial burden out of an emergency. So don't worry too much about diminishing your emergency fund when you need to. Deal with the situation at hand, use the money that you need to use, and after the fact, you can start topping it back up. So what do you do after you've had to use your emergency fund? Well, you basically top it back up. As soon as you're back to normal and the emergency situation has passed, you start to reallocate any extra income to topping back up your emergency fund. So if you were previously paying off debts or working towards a savings goal, you would temporarily pause those activities, redirect that money to your emergency fund and top it back up to your level that you've predetermined. And then after it's topped back up, you can resume those savings or investment or paying off debt activities. I hope you've learned a little bit more about what an emergency fund is and maybe been empowered to make one for yourself. I know that I sleep a lot better at night knowing that I have a pile of money for a rainy day rather than not. As always, thanks for spending some time with me today because I really appreciate it and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.